Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Parag Baines. I am at the Brookings Institute. I'm excited to be joined by my colleague Michael Jacobson with today's event. We are to say thank you for hosting this event and hosting the trip that we took to Finland to learn about their criminal justice system and their prison reform efforts over the years. My background, just briefly, is in criminal justice and public policy here in the United States. Most recently, I was the Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council under President Biden at the White House, and previously was a civil rights lawyer doing criminal prosecution of excessive force and abuse in prisons, as well as pattern or practice cases, reviewing systemic misconduct inside our corrections institutions, and more broadly, working on public safety and ensuring crime rates are low and that communities are safe. Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sharad. Hi, everyone. So just quickly, as Sharad said, I'm Michael Jacobson. I direct an institute at the City University of New York on state and local governance. I'm a sociology professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and a past president of the Vera Institute of Justice and New York City Probation and Corrections Commissioner. Just a quick reminder of the theme of the webinar series. I think as a lot of folks on this call know, over the past several years, Impact Justice and other U.S.-based reform organizations, Vera Institute of Justice comes immediately to mind, have led trips to Norway and Finland to learn more and delve into the Nordic model. We've been reflecting on learnings from these trips over the past several months, especially in Finland, in a series of webinars, of which this is the final installation. And I'll turn it back to Sharad.
Thanks, Michael. All right, we are here to talk about reform efforts across the world, but specifically in Finland and in the Nordic countries. This is a fireside chat today with Professor Tapio Lappi-Seppälä. He is Professor Emeritus and the former Director of the Institute of Criminology and Legal Policy at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Professor Lappi-Seppälä's career covers positions in national policy planning and in international cooperation in the Scandinavian Research Council for Criminology, Council of Europe, and the International Penal and Penitentiary Foundation, also the United Nations, and in the European Society of Criminology. His publications cover over 280 titles in several languages. His current research interests include comparative penal policy, sentencing, and comparative historical analyses on crime and punishment. So Professor Lappi-Seppälä will give a talk. Then Michael and I will come back and join him for a discussion to unpack some of the things that he shares with us further. And we will make sure to reserve 10 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So please drop any questions that you have in the comment section of whatever platform you're viewing this webinar on, and our team will pick those up and we'll go through them in the Q&A. With that, let me please welcome Tapio to the stage.
All right. Thank you. I'm sure, do you hear me? Okay. Yes, okay, good. Hello, everybody. And greetings from snowy Finland here. And thanks for inviting me to this discussion. I would also like to say Merry Christmas to you all. And even though I may look a little like Santa Claus, unfortunately, I have other items and other presents for you here now. So I've been asked to talk about the Finnish experience on reducing our prison populations, which is a lengthy historical story, but I tried to make it very brief, and then to touch some of the issues that would be of interest also for a US audience. Now, if we just look at the history, make a little comparison with three countries over a same period of time, the United States, England and Wales and Finland, you see the reason why Finland may be interesting country in this respect. If you put the next slide now, here you this is a comparison based on the number of prisoners counted relative to population, so you can directly compare the size of prison populations in United States, England and Wales, and this is for a long period of time from 60s to 2023. So what you see here now is that you have to look at the scale differences, because the US scale is very different. It starts from, on the left side, from 200 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants and goes up to 700 prisoners, and then comes again down to about 500. You see the similar rising trend in England and Wales, also, although this happens from a much lower level, but the profile is very similar, showing that these two countries were experiencing a steep increase in incarceration from the 60s, or let's say from the late 70s onwards. And then you see Finland of the same period of time from the 60s to till the present, and you see the trend is precisely the opposite. So the situation between these countries is that two of them were increasing their prisoner rates radically, and Finland made the exception, going to the opposite direction. And now this is the case for also if we take larger countries in comparison. But to do that, it might be a reason to do that so that we see the actual difference with the United States and other Western countries. The next slide, please. Here you see the comparison with 8 Western countries from 60s to 24. So what you see is that the United States makes a clear deviance, takes another step in the late 70s. And you see the other black line, this is now these countries are in the same scale, in the same picture. The other black line or dotted line there is Finland, going on the opposite direction. So the interesting situation is that really these two countries, they almost start from the same spot in the 60s, but they ended up in a diametrically different positions. Now, there is, of course, we know that the United States is not just one state. It is a collection of 50 plus 1 states. So we might ask then, is this something, does this apply to the United States as a whole, or should we look individual US states? I'm not going to go into that, but the next slide, please, if we put that, then we'll see this comparison, that if we put the look at each individual US state now there, and we look at Western European and Eastern European countries, you will see that yes, there are huge differences in the United States, internal differences in the United States, but still the end result is that every US state, individual US states, has higher incarceration, higher prison population than any Western European state as a general, also taking include the Eastern European states. So the issue we are talking is not only that there are few states in the United States, it is a general phenomenon, but at the same time, it's important that there are differences between the US states. So now, what I'm going to talk about is the drop we could see. I'm not going to talk about the increase in the United States. I'm going to talk about the drop of the prison population in Finland. If we take now the next slide, there is some discussion on the drivers, or what started this movement in Finland from the mid 60s onwards, because what we really had was a deliberate program, or a consistent policy to bring the Finnish prisoner rates down. But to explain this is not very simple, because there were several, let's say, there was several forces, several drivers which led towards this direction. So it is not just one simple explanation. One which I would left in a very important position is socio-economic transformations in Finland. Finland was joining the Nordic welfare state environment from the 60s onwards, and that the growing strength of the welfare state was visible in our social policies, including criminal policy. So there is this welfare state background on this movement. And then there was political and social activism. Throughout the all Nordic countries, there were grassroots movements among prisoners to improve prison conditions, and not only prisoners, but also all forms of institutional treatment was very critically viewed. And that has had impact as an instigating factor to put this reform on the move. They were influential. In a small country, you may have informal networks which cover research, law drafting, enforcement, and courts, which was all important part of that movement. And then for Finland, it was important that the Nordic cooperation, legal, political, and cultural affairs was intensified from the 60s onwards. There is a direct policy to harmonize criminal legislation between the Nordic countries. And this is visible that Nordic countries is now conceived as a family of legal systems in a way. And then I would add that the fifth point here is the change in the knowledge base and policy formation. There was a breakthrough in criminological research, which emphasized the adverse effects of imprisonment. And based on this research, there was a general distrust on institutional treatment in all forms. So this was a very much this kind of also this kind of debate of our outdated and too harsh criminal law system, and that this critical discussion then moved towards legislative reforms. Now, if you take a little next slide, there are some more general observations about the conditions under which, if we make a comparisons between other countries, make this kind of analysis, what explains, what unites countries which have lower incarceration rates, and what is common to countries which have a much higher incarceration rates. You see certain patterns there. And some of these patterns are now condensed in this slide. But anyway, what I would again put in the first place is the welfare state model. To have a universalistic welfare state where everybody is participating and everybody is also receiving benefits, which is the Nordic welfare state model, it has a policy implications in social policy and in criminal policy. If it provides social and economic security, it mitigates socio-economic differences and tensions between population. It supports trust and legitimacy of the legal system. It reduces fears and it reduces punitive projections. That was the favorable surroundings in the 70s and 80s. Now, these are things that they don't necessarily last forever, and the welfare state model is under constant move, and there are also negative moves in this respect. But if we explain the historical situation, we must stress that point. Then there is another also a common feature it is about the political culture, what kind of political culture you have and what are the institutional structures in political systems. Nordic political systems, they have been sometimes called as a consensual types of consensual democracies, which means they are multi-party system. They have coalitions, coalition governments, and this forces the parties and politicians and political movements to negotiate between themselves, to make compromises in policy making. It is not the two-party system where the winner takes all. In this kind of system, you need to be more tolerant and have compromises. So this has an impact on policy also. Then there are certain administrative bureaucratic structures which support expert-driven policy planning. There are no elected judicial officials, for example, in the Nordic context, which may be a very important point when we think about the American exceptionalism in penal policy. Media type is important, and also the fact that how well practitioners, prosecutors, etc., are trained in their work. What is their expertise and knowledge base also. So these kind of things were relevant. But again, now if we look very much more concrete terms, then we can look let's go to the next slide. So this was a background, and then we started to think how to do it, because we conceived that our high prison rate was a kind of national disgrace. We should do something about it. So the simple questions we asked at the time, for example, which groups don't belong in the prison in the first place? And the answer was fine defaulters. Which groups are overrepresented and create the overcrowding problem? And that was small property offenders and drunk drivers. Which groups stay in the prison too long? They were persistent property offenders. Which groups the prison harms the most? That was juveniles. So we started to plan programs that target all these areas. We take the next slide. So we see a list of key law reforms. I just list them so that you get the idea that this really was not one or two law reforms. It was an overarching approach. It covered offender groups by reducing the system of preventive detention, reducing default prison for unpaid fines, reduce the use of imprisonment for juveniles. It touched specific offenses, reducing penalties for theft and penalties for drunk driving, both very important groups because they are large groups of offense categories. They have large effects on imprisonment rate. We, in sentencing, we reduce the impact of recidivism in sentencing. And this is a very important detail in the criminal justice system, how you deal with reoffenders in your sentencing system. We increase the use of monetary values or day fines to replace prison sentences with fines. We extended the use of conditional imprisonment. We introduced community service and electronic monitoring as a true alternative to custody. And we restricted secondary imprisonment, which means that there were much less revocations and license breaches. In fact, they are non-existent when it comes to admissions to prison. No prisoners come just because of license breach in the Finnish system. And we expanded the use of early release and open prison enforcement. Take the next slide. So look at some of the result. Here you see the result, what happened. This is now the Nordic countries in comparison and the rate of prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants. The red line is Finland. You see how it comes from up there to 150 and drops down to the level of 60 and stays there. And even now it's the lowest among the Nordic countries. So Let's go to the next. This is just the end result. Here is an example what this meant when it comes to juveniles. Here you see the number of prisoners of the age of 15 to 17 years as in absolute terms and as percentage. Finland is a small country, so we have also in absolute terms we have very few prisoners. But in a way, what this means that we have about 10 offenders, juveniles under the age of 18 in prison, and the age of criminal liability is in Finland 15 years. So now we can take the next slide. Now, I'll just say a few words about the basic sentencing options. We come back to these in discussion. Just to summarize this, fines are the most used penalty in the Finnish code. 60% of cases go with fines. Conditional sentence means conditional imprisonment. It means that prison sentence is imposed conditionally, and 2 out of 3 prison sentences are imposed conditionally. Community service replaces short prison sentences, and so does electronic monitoring. Unconditional prison term is from 14 days 12 to life, and the typical sentence is around 3 to 6 months. Mean sentence is 12 months. So these all figures are about 1/3 of, if we compare to the US sentencing practice, 1/3 of the US sentence length in average. And there is no system of preventive detention, meaning a system for dangerous offenders. Now let's take the next slide. Some comments on the Finnish prison system. Prisons are small, in average about 100 prisoners per system. Largest prison is about 400 prisoners. We have one important element, and it is the use of open prisons. It's a long Scandinavian tradition. It has been a practice also in the United States, but to my knowledge, is not very widely used. It exists, but it's not very widely used. In Finland, 35% of all prisoners and 44 prisoners serving a sentence are placed in open prison. And average length of actually served prison term is about 5.6 months in the United States. The information I have is over 30 months. All prisoners are receive the early release, either after 1/2 or 2/3. Early release is a very important device in controlling prisoner rates. And the other very important is the practice you have in license breaches, whether there is so-called secondary imprisonment. We have very flexible revocation rules with community sanctions and conditional release. So we can go now to the next question and the latter part of this. And now look a little about the crime situation. Now, how much crime explains this change in the use of imprisonment? Was it so that because Finland, the crime rates were falling, that's why Finland reduced the use of imprisonment? And the answer is no. The other question is that how does the use of imprisonment then reflect on crime rate? Is it so that if you reduce the use of imprisonment, the crime rates will go up? Again, the answer is no. But of course, these are simple answers to very difficult questions, so we should modify them. I just show you a couple of slides that examine the role and relation of crime and incarceration in different countries. Let's take the first slide that compares Nordic countries. Some of the photos you already see. The left-hand photo shows in the Nordic countries the number of prisoners relative to population for a period of from 60 to 2015. And you see the exceptional role of Finland. When the other Nordic countries remained more or less stable, Finland came down from 150. On the right-hand side, you see reported crime in these same countries, how reported crime develops. And what is now essential here is that the crime curves are identical. even in the light of the fact that the prison terms are very different. The other Nordic countries were stable. Finland was coming down. Now crime rates go hand in hand in these countries, which indicates that there is something else which is much more relevant than imprisonment in affecting and explaining crime rates. Now, we could continue this by adding other countries, but what I do is only that I combine the 3 other Nordic countries together because they go hand in hand, and keep Finland separate, and then include England and Wales. And then we see another slide. That's next slide. Here you see again this left-hand side, the prison data for Finland. Now Finland comes from high up to the low right corner. The red line is the other Nordic countries remaining stable, and the dotted line is England and Wales coming from the opposite direction than Finland. So these are really 3 completely different prison curves. And on the right-hand side, you have the total recorded crime in these countries. And what you see, the crime curves are practically identical. Now, there are a lot of details that should be added to this analysis, but the point is that the crime curves really do not, or let's say prison curves do not seem to follow crime curves, neither do crime curves seem to follow prison curves. Now there are some other, let's take a next slide on this. I go back to the United States and ask a question: that does the high incarceration rate, the high increase in imprisonment in the United States, was it explainable by crime? And it is true, the homicide rate in the United States, it's much higher. This is homicide in relative to population in the United States and these Western countries. You see there is a level difference, but the trend is similar. Now, if we would look more close to the United States, we would find that this increase, this crime curve and the prison curve, they really don't meet in the case of United States, because in the United States crime increased much more quicker earlier than imprisonment, and then it went down and imprisonment still kept climbing. We take the next slide because it has this information. Here you see Nordic country, Western Europe, 3 countries, Canada and United States. And what is essential here, this is relative change of crime, recorded crime in these countries, violent crime, homicide and property crime separately. And what you really see here is a relative change in increase of crime in all these regions is similar than in the United States, even bigger. Not in absolute level, but relative change if we put the starting point on 100. And what you see here is that the prison rate remains stable in Nordic countries and Canada. In Western Europe, there was one increase period due to the Netherlands. But what you see here is the United States is very different in its profile. The crime rates, they moved in a similar manner, but the US prison curve is much higher and starts later than the increase of crime. Well, that's not the topic of this discussion. It's a topic of another article, but for comparative purposes. So I think I did manage to cover at least half of the points I had in mind, but perhaps in the discussion we can go there. Okay, thank you. This is now, I move to the next section.
Okay, thank you, Tapio. That was a lot of information in a really short period of time. You covered a lot of ground, and we appreciate it. Let's dig into some of these issues now with a little bit more depth. You know, let's start with some of the data and the research that you covered. You cited here in those last couple slides in particular the relationship or the lack of relationship between imprisonment and crime rates, and specifically that higher incarceration rates do not produce lower crime necessarily. There's also other research that we're familiar with here showing that when it comes to deterring crime, the certainty and the swiftness of punishment are much more important than the severity of punishment. What's your perspective on the research? How has it impacted the Nordic approach, but seemed not to have as much of an impact elsewhere, specifically in the United States?
Okay, thank you. It's a large question, definitely. And the way you summarize this is that's exactly the point. We just if we take that the research altogether, we need to observe what it says and what it does not say, and then. This critical observation on the deterrence, they do not say that punishment is irrelevant. That's not their point, but it says the reliance on the severity dimension is often overrated. People tend to think that that's relevant, but time after time, research says that that's something else. And what it looks like is the detection risk, which comes first. If we think about the potential situation, that is the point which is important for the offender, the thing that whether will be caught or not. That is something that can be in the potential offender's mind, not very distant, far distant consequences on sentencing practices. So that is so it doesn't mean criminal justice or punishment is relevant. It's just it's the detection risk. And then the other thing is that this does not take into account the actual effect of punishment, which is very much more indirect by nature, not the actual fear of very quick consequences. It is the force, that the ability of punishment and criminal justice to internalize norms. So that if you ask people why are they obeying the law, why they are not committing offenses, it's not because they say that, well, we are afraid of the police. The answer is that it's the right thing to do. And that's why it is that the criminal justice has had this effect on people's more, it has the norm internalizing. Sometimes we talk about the moral creating effect or a moral education effect of punishment. And that is a system that does not call for harsh penalties. It calls for legitimate, fair sentencing practices, something that people can respect as something that they take. It's a predictable, it's an equal treatment of and also proportional treatment. So that is the part where if we look at the Nordic way of thinking in criminal law and as the function of criminal punishment, it's the idea of this indirect effect of punishment, and the idea that criminal justice, let's say, compliance with the law is achieved through acceptance and legitimacy and fairness and expression of fairness on the application, not about the punishment severity. That has been, it's a long tradition already from the 60s. So deterrence in the Finnish, in the Nordic discussion, it's really not deterrence, it's got a moral enforcing effect and much less of direct. Of course, for some offenders, some offender groups, some offenses, the direct effect of deterrence is relevant. But we use the term general prevention instead of deterrence. That may say something about that. Sorry for long, difficult answer for a very, very difficult question.
Thank you, Tapio, and that was great. So I want to ask something actually that you didn't specifically go over in your talk, but you and I have discussed before, and that's the issue of recidivism, right? And so and the comparative recidivism between the U.S. and Finland. And on the one hand, the Nordic system, clearly the Finnish system specifically, is based on reintegration, rehabilitation. You're much better set up to do that. You're more well-resourced to do that in terms of the aid given to people who are in prison, and even post-prison sort of far surpasses anything in the US, and your prison conditions themselves are totally different, right? So on the face of it, you would think your recidivism rates would be superior to ours. On the face, that doesn't seem to be the case. The US recidivism, which is obviously pretty high, roughly 3-year re-imprisonment rate of about 50%, a lot of that made up of parole violations. Anyhow, yours, at least at a high level, doesn't appear to be that different, but it's at least for someone like me, very counterintuitive why it wouldn't be different. And so maybe you can talk for a couple of minutes either about that sort of technical comparison, which is probably flawed, but also the substantive reasons why we might not see that kind of difference that one would expect.
Yeah. Well, that's the unfortunate truth. The rates are high, and I think there are two issues involved, and one is certainly related to the difference on the prison population through differences in the filtering processes. What I mean is that Finland, or let's say United States, uses 10 times more prison than Finland. So you put different people in prison compared to Finland. You have to have a good prior conviction history to receive a prison sentence, unless your crime is very grave, where the first offenders, then we talk about very serious offenses. So we put initially higher risk, reoffender risk offenders in prison than the United States, and that is a very important factor. It means that the less you use prison, the higher your reconviction rates will be, and that is the logic which is, one should understand it in order to avoid wrong conclusions. And the other thing here is the other unfortunate truth that possibilities of imprisonment to reduce reoffending, really, they are poor, because prison does not affect those conditions or those forces that are behind offending and reoffending. So it might be, you can do there something, certainly, and that makes a difference, and every difference is important. But in a larger picture, the thing is that if you wish to avoid reoffending, do not put people behind the bars, because it really that's not the way to reduce reoffending. You may reduce that kind of amount of offending that would take place during the prison term, which is, then we could talk about incapacitation. But if you think making people better, that's not the so. Of course, then if you invest very much more, if you invest like the Norwegians do, they do double the money than Finland will do, I think we would achieve marginal gains there, certainly. But then, of course, you can use the money in many other ways too, in terms of crime prevention. That's another issue. But well, that is true. We cannot brag, as the Norwegians do, with their low reoffending rates, but it has gone down anyway. That's the positive news.
Tapio, I want to bring this up a level into the world of values, and you've referenced this a couple of times. Sort of, what is the criminal justice system trying to accomplish in Finland and in the other Nordic countries? And here, and I would say in every system, a critical value and marker of a fair criminal justice system is that people are held accountable for violating the law and for harming others. And in the United States, we think of accountability as punishment for the most part. That's what's reflected in our system, and I would say in many systems. The question of accountability sometimes gets lost in these reform conversations that we have, leaving those reform efforts vulnerable to criticism that they don't take victimization seriously, right? That they are going easy on people who have violated the social contract and hurt others, which is a serious concern. And in recent years, right now, actually, including this year, we've seen rollbacks on cash bail reforms. We've seen the recall of reform-minded prosecutors and the removal of them from office, not everywhere, but in certain places. And those moves were driven by concerns that people were being allowed to commit crimes and then go free. How has Finland thought about ensuring public faith that the system is holding people accountable for criminal conduct while also reducing incarceration and maintaining the reforms that you've made and continuing to improve the humanity and effectiveness of the system?
Yeah. Now, each language has its own terms on this discussion. And at first I was looking what is after that. Then I realized, yes, this is a very core. Accountable, I don't think we would use the term accountable, but yes, it's a part of it. Yeah. We have that as a central concept in our policy formation, and even in our most recent governmental program on crime policy. It talks about to ensure the criminal proceedings and crime process in a manner that will reach the right decision without any delays, etc. So yes, we have that same concept. For us, it refers mainly to the swift and fair due process of law. It refers to proportionality requirements. Proportionality is the leading sentencing priority principle in Finland when it comes to court. Then when you are talking about enforcement, then you talk about rehabilitation, reintegration, etc. So different principles apply in different parts of the criminal justice system. Accountability is not connected in paying back or retribution in the Finnish discussion. Victims' rights are essential priority. They are not connected to the delivery of punishment, but they are connected to fair process, respect of rights, support and help and restitution. So there are now changes in the respect. There is more when it comes to sexual offenses. There is more talk about also that it's also victims' interest that there is a punishment process. So there is this kind of move which was not before in our discussions. We did not, and we do not yet couple the victim rights and sentencing and in a manner that would have, for example, victim impact statements, or that we don't have that connection. It's about support, help, restitution and rights in several other respects. But I would say that these are the essential elements, and in our political discussion, where we think that there are the most difficult problems now, it is the timely solving the case. Now there are the delays in the criminal process which are deemed to be very deleterious and very harmful for the acceptance and legitimacy of the system. So we don't have the idea that you can buy acceptance and legitimacy by increasing the penalty levels. Or if we do that, we have a lot of international comparative research that shows that it's precisely the other way around, that the criminal justice systems which people trust and which they have confidence, they have the lower prison population, whereas countries with low trust, low legitimacy, there you have higher prison population. But that's again another type of discussion. But yes, we have that concept. We may have different, let's say, emphasis on different elements on that concept.
Yeah, it sounds like there's some real common ground, but also some significant distinctions between how Finland thinks about accountability and how we do here in the United States in the main. And the part about, I mean, I think people here want swift justice. They want the police to respond. They want crimes to be solved, and they do want people to be punished swiftly. They also often support very long sentences. And public research data is mixed on this, so it's certainly not a sort of across the board feeling, but that's been a part of the conversation here. And that kind of brings me to a larger question I wanted to ask you about the applicability of Finland's story to the US context. You showed us some really divergent charts. In the United States, it seemed that the data, this was the complicated chart where you had 4 different components to the graph. The United States incarceration bump followed quite neatly, right? As though you could almost slide it over and layer it on top of the way that crime rates rose. So incarceration following, crime rising, and thus incarceration was rising when crime was dropping. Whereas in other countries, and particularly the Nordic countries, we see incarceration staying low and being less responsive to the increase in crime. And so that, I wonder, could we do this here? Could we achieve the remarkable reduction in incarceration without increasing crime rates as a result here in the United States? There are some distinctions that I suspect our viewers are considering. Violent crime, you pointed out, is higher in the United States. Specifically, homicides are higher. We have a lot more guns in this country, and that's part of our violent crime epidemic. Crime is an incredibly charged political issue here. Politicians often argue that crime is up, even when it's down, as it has been the last 2 years. And I wonder if you could help us think about what lessons we should be taking away, particularly when you consider the differences in our political system and our media environment that you referenced at the top of your talk.
Now comes the really, really difficult part. If you phrase the question like that, you first did that, could you reduce your prison populations without causing an increase of crime? Yes, you could. But the question is, can you reduce the prison population? I don't think there is any reason to doubt the fact that if Finland was able to reduce its prison population into 1/3, and that had no visible effect on crime trends when we compare to other Nordic countries. So, and you can also see in many other countries that if you make changes in your imprisonment population, it's not reflected in crime rates in a manner one could assume. So there may be some effects, but not at all on the level one thinks. So yes, you can reduce prisoner rates without causing serious problems in the crime rate. But the question is, can you reduce the prison population? That is the difficult part. And now there are many structural differences which are problematic here, and one is now the political system in the United States. I'm not so talking about perhaps the whole two-party system and that, but I mean the localized democracy and the fact that you have so much on this elect judicial officers, prosecutors, and the courts, and then you have a lot of these platforms where you can which gives a possibility to conduct very populistic agendas in politics, and crime is a very easy topic to use there. So there are these kind of structural problems. What I think I would look first of some of the, if you look at the different US states, you find that they follow very different policies. There are states which use very wise, and they come almost to the European levels in the prison populations and in the policy responses, you would have good examples in the United States, which if you analyze those states, and that would be one way to look. And then there are certain more technical issues and details which are relevant. For example, this kind of which was secondary imprisonment thing. I mean that if you have license breaches on your community sanctions or on your parole and early release practices, because this is a group that is unnecessary to have in prisons. These cases could and should be dealt differently. If we look at the Finnish system or Nordic systems in general, you don't go to prison if you don't follow your license release conditions. You get a warning and you may get something else, but it's very rarely that you have to go back. And it is a large group of offenders. And then there is, of course, the whole mandatory. There are a lot of this. They are well analyzed in American literature. The mandatory sentence structures that you have, which make the real issue, the drug laws practices, and so this kind of technical solution, which look very strange from an outside observer, and which should be changed, and which would make a real great impact. But of course, ultimately, it's the thing that whether to what extent your policymakers and politicians see it's fruitful and successful to use crime and crime policy as a general political argument and politics, and that's of course where everything starts. But I don't know whether at this moment doesn't look very much that there's going to be a big change. So I would look the more technical details in the criminal justice practices which have an impact on incarceration rate. I would use more open enforcement and wherever possible. That would also be one help on overcrowding issues. But so I'm not sure I can say much more. But I think that the really important message is that according to all experience that we have, and also from other Nordic countries, if you regulate your prison population, if you are able to make changes with that, there will be no consequences of a general level on your crime rates. That's not relevant.
Thanks, Tapio, and that's a pretty headline takeaway from your presentation. I actually want to make sure, because we have a few minutes left, and I mean I could ask a whole bunch of questions, but that we have some time for at least one, maybe two audience questions. Can I ask, instead of me asking a question? Okay, here's one. So I'll read this quickly. Do you have any insight onto the profit drive around prisons in the U.S. compared to other Western nations?
Yep. If you explain what does it say, the profit drive? Does it refer to private prisons? Or
I assume it means some combination of private prisons, or what people refer to as the prison industrial complex, but certainly the introduction of private capital into.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as regards the Nordic countries, there is no this kind of connection. There are no private prisons, and according to the Finnish constitution, that would not be possible either, because delivering punishment is a state business and not to be delegated to anyone. And only very few. There are some European countries which do have a private prison. But then there are some elements involved that, for example, of the let's say in open prisons in Finland, where you do produce rather complicated manufactured different kind of furnitures and etc. That may have some connection with they are sold and they are marketed etc. So that kind of, but nobody makes money on the punishment system in Nordic countries, and to my knowledge, in only very few. Some of the Eastern European countries got interested on private prisons, whether Hungary maybe, I'm not sure, but this is not an issue, let's say so.
Thank you, Tapio. And do we have a time for? Yeah, so I'll let Chirag take this last question before we close it out.
Okay, yeah, we're going to question. Can you speak to the demographic makeup of the incarcerated population, and is it consistent with demographics in your society?
Okay, our demographic makeup has changed during the last 20 years or so. After opening the borders, etc., the immigrant population has increased as a whole population, and also in the prisons. Their role, their share of the prisoners is not in any important manner different from their share in the whole population. So that's, we could say that it's consistent in that respect. And we don't, then we are a homogeneous society in general. So we don't have the ethnic different ethnic groups. We have a Sami people up there in the north. It's a very small portion of people. They have their own legislative instruments, and there are so few people that there is no information about whether they are at all represented in prisons. But certainly there is not that kind of issue that you could find, for example, in New Zealand or Australia. And we have our own Roma people, gypsies, which is more difficult. They are overrepresented in prisons. They again are also a very small population, but that's true. They are all represented, and that is an internal problem in our policies. But we don't have exact information because we don't have. It's not allowed to have an ethnic register in Finland to have that kind of information. So I would say there are maybe some problems, but they are not on the comparable scale. So racism as such, then it's another issue. Now there's a lot of talk about that, and because the political environment is also changing, and the right-wing populism movements, which you can see around Europe, they are also here in Finland, and they have impact on our present policies, which is another story.
That's a fascinating way to close out, Tapio. You're leaving a teaser for us to pick up the conversation and talk about those shifts and how they impact the policy. But let me thank you, Tapio, and thank Impact Justice for hosting this webinar, and also our audience for tuning in and asking such good questions.
Thank all of you. Thanks again, Tapio.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Yep, take care, and Merry Christmas.